en VO, a podcast created by Nicolas Charles and Johan Chanois in collaboration with Morgan Julia. In this podcast, senior and young scholars look at all the TV shows, past, present and future, to dissect your favorite series content. Histoire en série en VO, a podcast that connects series to history and humanities. Welcome to Histoire en série en VO, a podcast created by Nicolas Charles et Johan Chanois. I'm Morgan Julia, and today I'll have the pleasure to talk with Luca Cantinelli, a Ph.D. student at the Laboratoire d'études du Monde Anglophone at Aix-Marseille Université. Luca Cantinelli's current research focuses on Maya Angelou's and Toni Morrison's non-fictional work. Today, Luca is going to talk to us about the TV show Lovecraft Country. Hello, Luca. How are you today?
Hello, Morgan. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. First, may I ask you, why did you choose this show?
Well, I was curious about Lovecraft Country because I'm currently working, among other things, on Afro-American representation in US literature. And to be honest, I also really like H.P. Lovecraft as a writer, and I thought this might be a good match between the two.
Well, that's a very good answer, a very good reason. So please enlighten us about Lovecraft Country.
Thank you. So today I will talk about Lovecraft Country, so a TV show which is based on Matt Ruff's novel published in 2016, which shares its title with the series. The series are developed by Misha Green, and the show dates back to last year, so it's a very recent take on H.P. Lovecraft's work. Lovecraft is a very important name in the field of weird fiction, and there are a lot of things I would like to say about him, but I'll just say a few words of introduction. He was a 20th century American writer who was born, raised, and dead in Providence, Rhode Island. He's one of the forerunners of weird fiction writing, which goes a lot farther than the generic term science fiction. And as a matter of fact, he was the father of his own subgenre, which is cosmic fiction. And he's still today the main name associated to it.
Okay. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about cosmic fiction?
Yes, so cosmic fiction, and in Lovecraft's case, cosmic horror fiction, focuses on what lies beyond the human ability to understand, to conceive. So on man's smallness in the face of entities of untold proportion and power. And one of the best illustrations of such a subgenre is well, the opening from H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, and I quote, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far."
Then could we say maybe that the core of Lovecraftian literature is to put the readers in a situation where they have to face the limitations of their understanding of their own lives and the world that surrounds them?
Well, yes, it's quite interesting because not only does it raise, yes, the question of one's own place in the cosmos for the reader, but also, and I wish I had time to talk about that, Lovecraft himself was very aware of his own inconsequence, of his own smallness in the society in which he lived. And cosmic fiction, so which is linked with Cosmicism, is quite important to keep in mind when we read Lovecraft, to have a better grasp of Lovecraftian horror. And well, the influence of Lovecraft's fiction pervades the works of countless writers, but not only writers, illustrators, filmmakers, and even more recently, board game designers. And even people who are not acquainted with his work may have heard of his 1920th short story, I've just quoted, The Call of Cthulhu. So Cthulhu being the creature featured in the story, and well, it became the figurehead, as it were, of Lovecraft's universe. So now about Green's show. So Lovecraft Country follows the story of an Afro-American family in the 1950s, which was a period in which racial segregation was particularly strong, but also a period of vigorous protest when the fight for Black civil rights won significant victories. For instance, Brown against the Topeka Board of Education on the unconstitutionality of racial segregation in public schools, or the 1957 Civil Rights Act concerning the voting process. And the show follows the character of Atticus Freeman, portrayed by Jonathan Majors, an Afro-American veteran from the Korean War, who goes looking for his missing father in the state of Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, an area in which a number of Lovecraft stories are set, hence the name Lovecraft Country. And to protect his family and friends, Atticus faces a cult of white sorcerers aiming to achieve immortality by using his blood and an old family secret. I won't spoil everything. And along with the characters, the viewer goes on a journey through the segregated United States, witnessing all its horror and all its madness. And the historical context is crucial here. There's an episode which is dedicated to the 1921 Tulsa massacre. So a dark event in US history. And the massacre is actually depicted on screen. That's one thing. And also there are references to the murder of young Emmett Till in 1955. So again, the darker aspects of the 1950s. And giving a voice to an Afro-American family in such contexts and under a Lovecraftian prism is, I think, particularly significant when we take into account the problematic aspects of H.P. Lovecraft, not only of the man, but also of his work.
Could you maybe develop a little bit about this problematic aspects?
Well, I am referring to Lovecraft's racism and hatred for what he considered foreign, for what he considered alien. And yes, the word alien is important here. For instance, the show mentions Lovecraft's 1912 poem entitled On the Creation of Niggers. And so you can see how this is problematic. And well, my point here is not so much to discuss this racism in itself, the hows and whys of it. And the whys, I mean, there's no justification whatsoever anyway. But rather to explain how remodeling the racial theme in an adaptation of Lovecraft's universe adds a significant depth to it. And well, adapting Lovecraft is never easy. You can't just add a few tentacles and sprinkle existential dread and call it a day. You have, well, there's an essentially a Lovecraftian touch that is particularly difficult to render on screen.
Why is it so difficult? Could you maybe give us some examples of Lovecraftian adaptations?
Well, in spite of this difficulty I was talking about, there were several noteworthy cinematic adaptations that have been directed. The first official one was an American international picture entitled The Haunted Palace, which was released in 1963. It starred Vincent Price and Lon Chaney. And well, interestingly enough, in the case of this first adaptation, Lovecraft's reputation as a writer was not yet sufficiently established, and the production team took precautions. While the film is based on Lovecraft's story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, the movie actually borrowed its title from a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, who was an already well-established master of horror. And I will try to talk about this during the time we have. So I will start by discussing, as you've asked, the challenges of well, creating a 10-episode long show based on Lovecraft's work, a work that is known for its peculiar atmosphere rather than for its action, and well, all the creative choices that it entailed. Then in a second time, I will argue that Lovecraft Country is not merely an adaptation of Lovecraft's universe, but a subversion that somehow managed to do the original material honor. And I will end the discussion by elaborating on what I believe is at the core of Lovecraft Country. That is to say, to reflect on what makes us humans and what makes us monsters, because the line between the two is far from being clear-cut. So yes, my first point about adapting Lovecraft on screen. Well, how to adapt Lovecraft on screen? As you may know, well, a number of writers have expanded Lovecraft's vision through their own literature. So what is known by the fans as the Cthulhu mythos. But as I've said, his influence has spread much beyond the field of literature. And Lovecraft has had a tremendous impact on pop culture as a whole. And this impact was also a visual impact. And there are countless comics, visual novels, and movie adaptations based on Lovecraft. And well, each has its own take on Lovecraft's work, but there are usually some fixtures and topoi.
Could you maybe tell us some of these fixtures and topoi?
Well, generally, yes, it's a bit cliche. It's the archetypal squid monster that we all have in mind when we think Lovecraft.
True.
And well, most of the adaptations have managed to insist on yes, the cosmic dread that is so specifically Lovecraftian. And so one of the main difficulties to adapt Lovecraft on screen, well, it would seem, according to several directors, is due to the very nature of the writer's work, because the essential horror in Lovecraft fiction lies in the fact that it can barely, if at all, be described. So described, let alone represented on screen. And it is revealing that Lovecraft himself did not want his work to be adapted on screen. He said, and I'm quoting Lovecraft here, "I shall never permit anything bearing my signature to be banalized and vulgarized into the infantile twaddle which passes for horror tales amongst radio and cinema audiences." Yes, so while Lovecraft sometimes tried to offer detailed accounts of the physical appearance of his creatures, these accounts are they are confronted to the unspeakable quality of what they intend to describe, because merely seeing these creatures would mean for the character to go instantly mad. And the significant number of audio adaptations when compared to visual adaptations, so especially in the beginning, is not so surprising, to the extent that, as I said, Lovecraft fiction developed atmosphere rather than action. And that is also why several filmmakers acknowledged the difficulty to adapt it on screen, because while much of the horror it conveys is either suggested or hidden. And as a consequence, illustrators and directors are faced with an artistic choice. Relying on an eerie, typically Lovecraftian atmosphere at the cost of action, on the one hand, or trying to actually display the horror in full view, and thus taking the risk of downplaying the Lovecraftian quality of these creatures, supposedly too awful to be seen. And it has been done in a number of cases. So with the aforementioned cliche of the giant squid as the archetypal Lovecraftian monster, that's one of the risks. Well, Lovecraft Country seems to have taken a safer middle road, as they did not attempt to represent the more unappealing creatures of the Lovecraftian roster. The show chose to convey horror in other ways, so straying from the archetypal Lovecraftian pattern. For instance, through ghosts, through Ouija boards, and legendary creatures such as the Kumiho, a nine-tailed fox spirit from Korean folklore.
Then can the show still be called Lovecraftian, or does it merely use the power of his name, since it does not follow exactly what Lovecraft was doing in his work?
Well, I believe that Lovecraft Country is still very much Lovecraftian in its own way, as the essentially horrific aspect of Lovecraft's universe, well, is not so much hideous creatures, but yes, this cosmic dread, this existential dread, and the series has more than its own share of it. But I'm keeping that for the end. Right now, I'd like to talk about how the show managed to build on Lovecraft's universe, rather than merely relying on it as a brand image, as some other adaptations might have done.
Amazing.
And yes, that's my second point, which is about broadening Lovecraft's universe, and that in more senses than one. So after his death, Lovecraft had his own cult of writers who wished to contribute to the universe he had created, and each adaptation added something to it, helped expanding it, so through various creative choices. And the term Lovecraft Country, which gave its title to the show, refers to all the locations, real and fictional, mentioned in Lovecraft's original work, as well as those added later on by other writers of Lovecraftian fiction. For instance, the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts, was created by Lovecraft and was Matt Ruff's inspiration for the fictional town of Ardham, Devon County. So the show introduces the actual writer, H.P. Lovecraft, and the fiction he wrote, but also part of this very fiction as reality in the show. And this meta dimension is also played upon with the book Lovecraft Country, which is being featured in the show, but written not by Matt Ruff, but by Atticus's son, George Freeman. And well, the very title, Lovecraft Country, is rich in meaning. It is significant. It refers not only to these fictional locations, it also refers to a place ruled by intolerant white men, and Lovecraft proves he could be one of them. It also, and maybe most importantly, refers to a shared universe, which necessarily implies divergent perceptions and a plurality of voices to be heard. And as such, Lovecraft Country is not exclusively Lovecraft's own, and that is highlighted in the show.
And how does this plurality of voices is harmonized in the show? Is it even possible to harmonize such a wide range of contribution? And what does it really mean for the identity of the Lovecraftian literature?
Well, a balance was found between making other voices heard on the one hand, and on the other hand, respecting Lovecraft's creative legacy, with several nods to his work and to pulp literature in general. For instance, in episode 1, Atticus is seen reading a bound copy of Apprentice of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and it was first published in 1912 in a serialized form, so in pulp magazines.
Could you maybe tell us about pulp literature and magazine?
Yes, it is difficult discussing Lovecraft without mentioning pulp literature, because during his life, Lovecraft has never been published in hardbound copies, maybe with only one exception at the very end of his life. So pulp magazines were very popular magazines in the first half of the 20th century. They were cheap, and they catered for an audience who wanted thrills, violence, and, well, let's say it, sexual content. So there's no sex in Lovecraft stories, but there is a very specific, a very kitsch aesthetic to pulps. During his life, Lovecraft had to be content with his stories being published in the pages of pulp magazines, and it was something he despised, as he wanted to achieve the respectability of a writer published in bound copies. That was his reasoning. And it was only after his death in 1937 that a publishing house called Arkham House was created specifically for his fiction and published in 1939 a collection entitled The Outsider and Others, which is actually featured in episode 1. So the show acknowledged the Lovecraftian pulp aesthetic, for instance, with Atticus's Dream in episode 1, in which we can see very kitsch UFOs, so UFOs, the archetypal flying saucer, and tentacle creatures flying everywhere. And that's what I refer to when I say pulp aesthetic. And I could add that I don't remember reading about spaceships in Lovecraft. It is, I think, a nod to pulp literature as a whole. On the other hand, the show developed themes that are utterly absent of Lovecraft's original work. So I'm thinking of money, of sex, and the matter of sexual orientation, which are recurring themes in Lovecraft Country. I could also mention religion, because Lovecraft was a staunch atheist, and apart from The Dream in the Witch House, I can't think of any story in which to find some form of biblical intertextuality. His monsters have nothing to do with demons, and his cosmicist philosophy resides outside of faith. However, in episode 2, mention is made of the order of beings in the universe, so as sanctioned by divine order, with everyone and everything in its place. So that being achieved through the power of naming. So in the Bible, Adam naming the beasts. And the ultimate power in the show lies in a grimoire called the Book of Names. So in Lovecraftian fiction, the best known tome of forbidden lore and accursed knowledge is the Necronomicon. But in the show, a special emphasis is made on the power of naming, and I believe it is significant. It belonged to the slaveholders who erased their slaves' identities to replace them by new ones. And during the Jim Crow era, the order of beings in society was dictated by white people. And that may also be why Lovecraft Country is about initiation, about finding one's identity and one's place in the universe, as it is the case for the character of Hippolyta in episode 7, when through astral projection, she's able to live multiple different lifetimes. For instance, as a dancer for Josephine Baker, as a Dahomey Amazon, or as a heroine of sci-fi pulp magazines. And she realizes she exists in a world where, and I'm quoting her, I can name myself anything.
It's fascinating. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think the show is quite interesting. The racial issue is central to the show. And for instance, Gil Scott-Heron's 1970 poem Whitey on the Moon can be heard at the end of episode 2. So the poem criticized the money that was spent on the moon landing, so money that could have been used to fight poverty and marginalization instead. And the poem is recited in a voiceover during a scene in which a cult of wealthy white sorcerers intends to use Atticus's blood to complete their ritual. It appears quite ironical because usually in Lovecraft's work, the typical cultists are colored people whose culture is automatically assimilated to eldritch and bloody rituals. And here it is the opposite that takes place. And when Lovecraft offered such obvious monsters as his great old ones, it is interesting and also challenging to pause and reflect that monsters do not need to have tentacles and a trillion eyes. And that is what Lovecraft Country invites us to do. And that will be my final focus. In Lovecraft Country, monsters put into perspective the inhumanity in human beings, or rather, the darker aspects of what it means to be human. Because what is a monster? When we call something inhuman, is it not precisely to avoid facing the fact that it is human? Something that no other animal would commit. And the line between human and monster is not self-evident. For instance, in the show, on the one hand, Atticus, so he's the protagonist, but he is himself guilty of several war crimes he committed during his service in South Korea. And on the other hand, the Kumiho, a legendary creature, so who is not human, is able to have feelings and to fall in love. So the first thing that usually comes to mind when talking about monsters is their physical appearance. In episode 8, the character of Ruby, who's a black woman, says to William, who's white, blonde, and blue-eyed, she says, "You look like a monster." So this could be linked
to World War II.
Yes, to the iron model promoted by the Nazis during World War II, but maybe more generally, what has been considered by some people as the standard for the Western definition of beauty, while this is destroyed by Ruby through a lifetime of individual and collective experience of racism and segregation. In a society in which Black people can be prey to predators with a gun or a rope. And as Atticus points out in episode 8, I quote, "We are surrounded by monsters." And it is revealing that in episode 1, the dream Atticus has with monsters and flying saucers appears no less nightmarish, well, maybe less nightmarish actually, than the reality he wakes up to sitting in the back of a bus in the colored section of the bus. And still in episode 1, Atticus's friend Letitia jokingly tells him that a blob with 1,000 eyes is not scary at all, as it can be outrun. And just a few minutes after this joke, Atticus and Letitia had immense trouble outrunning a police sheriff who wanted them hung just for being there. And this sheriff, considering himself at the top of the food chain, ends up slaughtered along with his men by actual blobs with 1,000 eyes. So that could be one definition of a monster, a human being preying on another because of the color of their skin.
Indeed, actually, when you say it that way, human beings are way scarier than these blobs and flying saucers. Could we say then that more than an adaptation, Lovecraft Country is a reappropriation of the Lovecraftian lore, aiming and denouncing racism in our society, but maybe also in Lovecraft's work? Could it be seen as tackling Lovecraft's own monstrosity?
Well, Lovecraft, in his fiction and in his letters, also he wrote a great number of letters, proved that he could be, well, yes, monstrous in a way, because he had that part of monstrosity in himself, that rejects, that singles out. And the fact is that Lovecraft Country highlights the original aspect of the word monster, So this aspect being linked to the etymology of monster, the Latin verb monstrare meant to show, and by extension here, to single out what stands as different, as strange, as alien, just as Black people were segregated during the Jim Crow era. And during this period, it was not about singling out an individual, but about singling out an entire community and branding them as monsters. In episode 1, for instance, a white waiter is left speechless. He's struck with horror when Atticus and his friends enter his diner. And so he then goes to a phone in the back room and he says, "I did not serve them, not after what they did to Miss Lydia." And it didn't matter that Atticus and his friends never even met this Miss Lydia, because to the waiter, they are interchangeable members of an alien race with no notion whatsoever of individuality. So because they are referred to with the pronoun they. So for instance, as in the movie entitled "They Came from Beyond Space." So you perceive what happens here.
Yes, of course, as the Black people, they simply are perceived as not belonging to the same world, to the same dimension.
Yes, exactly. And in that regard, I think that it would be relevant to evoke the philosophy which was dear to Lovecraft, and which I mentioned earlier. I'm talking about Cosmicism. So Cosmicism is a model of thought, a philosophy which Lovecraft applied in his fiction and in his life. So, as I've said, it is the realization of man's inconsequential place in the vast and uncaring cosmos, linked with the deep fear of absolute freedom in the utter absurdity of the void, and feeling small, feeling inconsequential in an uncaring society resonates with the experience of some of the Black actors in the show, until they claim their place and assert their existence as part of this world too. Not so much about otherworldly aliens, I think, as it is about what it feels to be treated as an alien in one's own country.
Wow. Thank you so much, Luca, for this presentation. This analysis makes me want to watch the show. I'm sure the listeners will agree with me. It was very enlightening, and I particularly love the way you develop the prism of racism and alienation in this TV show. And this allows us to perceive Lovecraft in a whole new way, which I am sure everyone is going to appreciate. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad. Thank you very much.
Well, everyone, this was Histoire en série en VO, and it was with Luca Cantinelli. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you a great day.
Don't miss a single episode. Join us on Twitter at Histoire en Série and find our guest presentation and bibliography on our website www.histoireenserie.com.
Such a beautiful planet populated by a strangely animals. And there's a mist again. No